Hello and welcome to another episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you've been studying Stoicism for quite a long time, or even briefly, I guess, you'll probably know that one of the favorite topics of the ancient Stoics was death. Memento mori is the saying, it means remember death, right? This was such a key focus of the philosophy. And that's what our episode is all about today. Because the guest who I have on today is actually the co-founder of an app that many of you might know. It's called WeCroak, and this app is all focused around reminding you every single day that you are going to die. And as you'll see when we dive into this conversation, this app has had very interesting effects on people all around the world, getting them to think deeper about their lives, and also has had some wonderful mental health results as well. So the guest who I have, I should probably tell you his name, is none other than Hansa Bergwall. And for those of you who don't know, of course, Hansa is the co-founder of the WeCroak App and host of the WeCroak Podcast. And his mission is to use death, salience, mindfulness to remind people that life is short and precious. Now, if you want to check out the app, you can go to WeCroak.com. But with all of that said, I really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So here we go. My conversation with Hansa Bergwall. All right, so Hansa, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you and see where we take it. As I was saying before, I'm constantly surprised by how I will have a whole bunch of questions and I'll probably ask maybe one or two of them. I'm sure that's going to be how we go today. But I guess I want to start out by saying, just tell me a little bit more about yourself, and maybe we'll then dive into a bit of a conversation about ultimately why we're here today for the WeCroak app. So dive in.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Simon. It's a delight to be here. And my name is Hansa Bergwall. And a few years ago, back in 2017, I was really getting into a meditation kit, and I was doing it daily, which I still do. And I was getting a lot from it. So I became curious. Where did these practices come from? Why do we do them? What did people say about them who developed these ideas? And so I started doing a lot of reading about Buddhism, about meditation practice, and these kinds of things. And I kept on coming across these mortality meditations. There were a lot of them. Everything from meditating over dead bodies that had been laid out to rest high in the Himalayas, and watching them decompose over days, to different meditations on your breath, where you imagine every breath as your last. And finally, I was reading this 5th century Buddhist scholar his name was Buddhaghosa. And he said that of the 40 different kinds of meditation, all the different body scans and meditation on the breath, only 2 are always beneficial. The cultivation of kindness, or metta meditation, which I'd heard of, and a lot of people do, and the recollection of death, which at the time I didn't know anyone who was doing. And I had this aha moment that not only was this stuff, these death meditations, part of the tradition, but they were a central part, and that somehow they'd gotten left out, and that to really do it right, I needed to do it. So I started doing it a lot and absolutely loving it, getting a lot from the practice, kept on researching it. And then as I kept reading, I found some articles about the tiny Himalayan nation of Bhutan. And they have a folk saying there that to be a happy person, you have to contemplate your mortality 5 times a day. And to me, that just felt so simple and beautiful. And it also felt programmable. And I wanted something that would remind me to do that on my day, just sort of like an easy sort of micro adjustment constantly throughout the day. I convinced this guy named Ian Thomas, who was renting my room, extra room on Airbnb at the time, to make the app with me, because he was an iOS developer. And we both kind of wanted it on our phones. And I have a marketing and PR background, so I reached out to some people about it. And in December of that year, it kind of blew up, way beyond our wildest expectations. So that today there's, a couple 100,000 people that have tried it, tens of thousands of people that are using the app daily. And it still has the same core function. It reminds you you're going to die 5 times a day at random times. It has a quote that comes with it from a philosopher, a poet, a drag queen, anyone we thought said something wise about impermanence. After all, we all die. And we've also built in a little bit more of a deeper experience for people who really want to go deeper with death meditations. There's a membership, a LEAP membership in the iOS program that has a daily review about really living closest to what your real values are each day, as well as sort of weekly challenges, which are often other kinds of meditations in the impermanence sort of death variety. Some other features like adding photos and stuff like that. So what kind of our mission is today is it's really about reminding people that life is short and precious, and don't wait. Whatever it is you want to do it now. And that's what the WeCroak app is all about. And it's been the honor of a lifetime, reminding people.
Yeah. It's funny, right? Like the honor of a lifetime reminding people that they're going to die. Like I've often had experiences where I'll talk to people about this idea of memento mori. I mean, I have it tattooed on my arm, and so people will often ask, and I'll tell them, well, it means remember death, or contemplate your death, and the general reaction is that that's a pretty morbid thing to get tattooed onto yourself or to remind yourself of often. And so I wonder with you, like what did you actually get out of these meditations that you were doing, these various forms of meditations around death? What was the experience like, or what was the transformation like that you saw in yourself by that constant contemplation of death?
There were so many, but at its core for me was tremendous relief. And I'll tell you why. Back when I was 11 years old, the truth about life and death happened to me. My mother passed away suddenly from an aneurysm, kind of thing where everything was fine when I went to bed. I woke up the next morning and my world had been turned over. So, there's a part of me that always knew that death was real and true and could happen at any time because I'd had that early formative experience. But then I'd gone back into a very death phobic, 21st century America, or late 20th century, I guess is what it was at the time. And, no one was talking about death, and everyone was acting as if everyone was going to live to 80 plus. And it always felt kind of phony to me. So there was a part of me that was just like, oh, I don't have to run away from this anymore. I can face it head on. And if I can accept this truth, which I've always known as real, I will feel better. And that's what I found to be true, is that leaning into this stuff that, had been the scary boogeyman of my childhood and my life for so long, and finding a way to welcome it and make peace with it, gave me tremendous relief. I was no longer running. There have been other, side benefits to that, which I also heard from other users. A lot of people use it for courage, asking for that raise, or, hitting on that person who's the most beautiful person you've ever seen at the bar, or whatever it is that you might not do. And then you go, wait, I could die tomorrow. Why don't I just do it and see what happens? The worst that can happen is, they say, nah, not interested, or no, not today, in which case you usually haven't actually lost that much. It's a small thing compared to death. Other use cases I hear a lot are people using it for grief, actually, just because a lot of people, get shunned a little bit by their community when someone close to them dies, like a child or a parent or a partner. People feel so awkward. They don't know what to say. We're not in society very well versed in talking about death. So sometimes people that people were counting on, and the app helps to remind people that everyone goes through this, if they haven't been singled out, especially for tragedy, harm, suffering. We all lose everyone in the end. That's really beautiful. I get a little tearful when I get those emails.
Mm.
And so it's a wide range of just mindfulness kind of
Yeah.
ideas. And other one that I really want to point out that works for me, and I think for a lot of people, is we tend to get stuck in ruts in life, especially as we go on into adulthood. We find that comfortable job, we find that relationship that's okay, but maybe we're not happy, or we find all these sorts of things. And what sort of death mindfulness does that none of the other ones do is create urgency to change when we need it.
Mm.
Sometimes if you're doing a lot of breath meditation or body scans, you can just get really relaxed and maybe stay in that 60 plus hour a week job that you hate because it's more manageable. Whereas if you're reminding yourself that it could all be over tomorrow, all of a sudden you're like, wait, do I really want to spend another year here? Or do I want to quit this and find something a little bit closer to where my heart is? And I love getting the stories of people who sort of leap into life transformation because they have a little bit more urgency to do so.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're using language like leap into a transformation. Talk to me more about the symbolism of the frog and the WeCroak. What's the story behind the name?
Yeah. So WeCroak is, it's a stupid pun. We were trying to be lighthearted about it. Fun.
Yeah. I'm always
approachable,
up for a good
if
pun.
you will. And I think what we wanted to do is, be really respectful of, Bhutanese philosophy and folk sayings. And we wanted to take what they said seriously, like, to be a happy person, you must do this. Like, okay, we're going to try it. But it didn't feel right to sort of borrow, I don't know, the Bhutanese sort of cultural strappings. So we decided to make up our own sort of symbols of death and what this app was about. So it's a poison dart frog from the Amazon. It's the app icon. It could really kill you if you were to lick it or something, which don't do that if you're ever down there. And then there's the poem of WeCroak. And so it all means death ultimately, but we just created our own sort of new, fresh image for what it would do. And I grew up in the northeast of the United States, where during the summer, frogs are just the noisiest damn things in the entire world. They just go on and on all summer night, croaking and peeping. We call them peepers here. And I'm not sure if poison dart frogs do that, but there was something about the frog image that really felt right for what this app is meant to do, which is just incessantly remind people of death 5 times a day for as long as they keep those notifications on.
Yeah, I love it, man, and especially the pun. But what are some other experiences that you've seen people have on the app? I'm sure you've had many emails from people and having great experiences of just reminding themselves constantly. I guess I'm trying to get an even fuller picture of exactly what people are getting out of these sorts of meditations, because I think it's something that we, especially in the kind of realm of Stoicism, we always talk about this idea of memento mori. We always talk about remembering death, but nonetheless, there is such a wide experience of what this can mean for people. What are some other experiences that you've seen people have through the app, just being reminded 5 times a day?
Yeah. So part of the app is it's randomness. You never know when a notification will come, just like death. And you never know which quotation you're going to get. So there's a magic 8-ball sort of feeling.
Okay, so it's not scheduled. It's just like it'll just pop up. Okay.
So it sort of inserts yourself in the day. There's a ghost in the machine aspect. So I've heard a lot of funny stories, which it's happening so much that it's bound to happen that sometimes it will feel a little uncanny. And that was. Yeah, it was designed to be part of the app, and it's it's randomness, it's stuff, but sometimes it will really hit exactly right. And so I get those stories. Like there's a Thich Nhat Hanh quote, which is a famous meditation teacher about getting out of anger. And I have more than once had people write me to say that they got a notification and that quote in the middle of a fight with their spouse or a parent, or something like that, and that it immediately took the hot air out of the fight. They were just like, holy shit, like, how did this happen? Let me take a few deep breaths, like in the scale of life and death, the thing we were actually fighting about was really small, and they end up actually like laughing about it. So that's stories like that are really great, where it's just like inserting itself into life. Another one I get all the time is like, it interrupts you in the middle of distraction, because all of us are sort of on our computers and our screens all the time. We're kind of sort of doom scrolling the news, or social media, or whatever, and we don't actually mean to be doing that a lot of the time. Like, we wake up with grand expectations of how much we want to get done, or that we're actually going to read that book we've been meaning to read, or do our stoic exercises if you're into that. And we end up, looking at outrageous posts on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. And so I hear all the time of like, it'll catch me when I'm, doing something I really didn't mean to do. And I go, oh, and I take a deep breath and I put that down and I turn back toward what I meant to be doing. And I love that as well. And then the other one is, sometimes people get the notifications when they're out on a beautiful date with their partner, or taking a walk, doing exactly what they meant to be doing that day. And what they tell me is like, sometimes I don't even look at the quote. I just feel a lot of appreciation in that moment that, I have this brief life, and like, I'm exactly where I want to be right now. And it sort of increases the sort of emotional resonance and the gratitude for experiences that are already good. So I love hearing that one too. It's just kind of, the reality of death is always true, but we tend to forget it easily. It's a very slippery concept for our minds. And I think that's part of why it's a great recollection, a great meditation. And it's always relevant in a way. So it's kind of interesting to watch as people are getting it throughout their day, whatever it is they're doing, how they start recoiling from things that aren't good for them and start feeling more appreciation for the people and things that are. Because when we get right down to it, when we pose death, it makes the question of like, what do we really care about come really front and center. And it's much easier to start rejecting the things that aren't working for us and really appreciating the things that are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm even just wondering if you can get some sort of artificial intelligence to start listening to people and pick the ultimate moments throughout the day.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that, just this idea that halfway through an argument, you'll get this reminder, hey, you're going to die. Oh yeah. And then just to bring yourself back to an attention and careful approach in life. There's this idea that Seneca often talks about around death, because he loved talking about death. It was one of his favorite things to discuss. And one of the things that he says is, death is kind of like, it's almost like the ultimate fear that we have. And so if you can overcome that fear of death, that's going to flow into the rest of your life, and it's going to help you to overcome other fears, because ultimately they're not as bad as death, or at least that's my understanding of some of the things that he's saying. Have you found that there is an effect of, well, let me ask you this, people are reminded, okay, I'm going to die, and then they are reminded to take more seriously the situations in their life, and to maybe get a move on a few of them that they've been procrastinating on. I'm wondering, do you feel as though these meditations on death, and not even just on the WeCroak app, just in general, these meditations of death help you to overcome the fear of death, or does it make you cling more onto life? Like, let me explain this more. Like, I often think about death, and I often think, meditate on this idea of, okay, I'm going to die, and this should teach me about how to live well. But there's also the potential that what I'm doing is actually saying, okay, death is coming, so I'm going to grasp onto life more, and it's almost like I'm not going to know until that final moment whether I was not afraid of death or whether I was really afraid of death, and I just really wanted to grasp onto life as a result of knowing that I'm going to die. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, it does. And I'll answer it kind of because I love the Stoics. I read them too, and I love Seneca. He really inspired me a lot with some daily review exercises I've been doing for the last couple of years and loving. And a lot of those insights from Seneca and the other Stoics about why we have to look at death and do these recollections often in the modern scientific era. Not only do those claims still seem really interesting from a practical level if you want to try them, but they're testable now, and they've been proven to have quite a strong psychological impact. I don't know if you've heard of terror management theory, but it is sort of modern science meets, looking at mortality salience, or these reminders of death. So the first generation of terror management theory, they would set up these experiments. And there's an early famous one where they actually found the US judges, so people who should be the most judicious people, good at making logical, rational judgments all the time, we hope. And they didn't know what they were being tested on, but they received a bunch of questions. And one group got a reminder that they were going to die. And the other group had talked about dental pain instead of death. And then after going through a bunch of questions, there was a lot of noise in it too, so people didn't really know what they were being tested on. They were asked to make some judicial decisions around sentencing or setting bail for a prostitute that had been captured. And I forget the exact number, but it was a huge, the group that had been primed on death, set bail 10 times higher than the other group or something like that. So there's this way in which these reminders of death can suddenly, without you even knowing it on the conscious level, sort of create adrenaline, create sort of these outsized impacts. And if you're not used to leaning into it in a mindful way, these things can really get you off kilter. So the next generation of terror management theory kind of is looking at it from an exposure therapy kind of way. Are some of these, terror management sort of ideas at the core of some mental health issues, such as OCD or something like that? So there's actually an Australian researcher named Rachel E. Menzies. I have her book. I just got it on my desk, who is fantastic, who designed these experiments around hand washing, where, she worked with people with some light OCD, and the people who, had gotten some primed questions, basically she was just measuring how long people washed their hands. She would put some gloop on their hands, and one group had been primed with a reminder about death and sort of the opening kind of thing. The other one just knee pain surgery or something like that. And the group that got primed about death washed their hands longer. But then also doing experiments around, but if you do more and more of this sort of exposure to death, does that response start coming back down so that you can have a more sane response all the time? Because the truth is, death is out there. You will get reminders in the course of life. And if it makes you scared and sane and contributes to things that really cause people a lot of pain and suffering, then facing that fear of death becomes really important. And the only way, because we live in a world where we all die, the only way to relief is through it, through sort of exposure therapy, lots and lots of reminders of death, which is kind of what our app does, not as a therapeutic thing, but it falls very much in line with some of the science coming out about both the outsized impact that death has on our psychology and how much energy many of us are running around spending trying to manage our terror about death. That's where that term comes from. So it's really, really interesting if you want to go down, the rabbit hole of sort of the questions scientists are posing today and how it relates to this old time Stoic philosophy about using this power to find the view from above, sort of these larger perspectives, some peace, some more equanimity. It really sort of bears out at the experimental level on a huge way, which I think is awesome. Those Stoics really knew what they were talking about.
Yeah. It just reminds me that we are so liable to outside influences, right? I mean, like you get a reminder of death and all of a sudden you completely change the way you do your job and you're a judge. Like I think I heard that, oh man, this is like secondary information, so it might be completely incorrect, but I'm pretty sure I heard that they did an experiment with judges where they found that judges were far more lenient with their sentencing after lunchtime. So all it took was a meal, and all of a sudden they're being more lenient with their sentencing. And you just think, we are so liable to influence and we don't even recognize it. But that experiment you mentioned with the hand washing, so let me just confirm if I got this right. So essentially they were reminded of death and the people who were reminded of death started washing their hands longer, I guess suggesting that the suggestion of death was enough to make them think, well, crap, I need to take care of myself a bit more because it's coming.
The idea that Rachel E. Menzies kind of purports is that our fear of death is the worm at the core of a lot of mental health issues. And she's trying to identify which ones and how this kind of exposure therapy, can be used to sort of help people calm down the worst of these behaviors that are causing them a lot of suffering.
Yeah.
So, what they're testing there is, so death creates this strong response.
Yeah.
So that is one of the driving things. And if you can start to work with that, through exposure therapy, which is the idea of if you have a phobia and you're constantly exposed to it, that it will lessen and lessen, that you can actually have relief. Even though the first time it does it sort of brings it up a little bit. Yeah,
of course. And you've talked a little bit about this kind of death phobia that you find in North America. I know somebody else who's talking about this a lot. I'm not sure if you've come across Stephen Jenkinson's work, but he does a lot around this idea of death phobia. What have you noticed in your life growing up in North America, in terms of the general population's approach or denial of death?
A lot of terror and avoidance. When my mother died when I was 11, actually, it was really interesting. Like family members, my grandparents lived nearby, and they showed up like twice over the next summer, even though they were a 10-minute drive away, cried and just stopped visiting because it was too hard for them. And that was true of a lot of family friends and family. And I hear that from people to this day, that a lot of people who are going through grief get shunned by friends, community, family members, people who really should be there for them. And it's because people just feel so uncomfortable about death that even being around someone where they might have to talk about it is so intolerable that they make excuses. They just don't show up, if you will. And I experienced that, and I still hear it all the time from people. So we're really bad at helping people when they need help the most because of the phobia around death. But then there's so many other things. I have a podcast as well, the WeCroak Podcast, where I read a lot of books about death and dying, including from a lot of people who work in hospice and palliative care. And, one of the things they say is that, being at a deathbed of someone you care about can be one of the most meaningful experiences of your life. Holding someone's hand at their last breath. It might not be easy, but it can be a momentous sort of just moment, a mark of a passing. And one of the ways that you can really turn that into more stressful and hellacious is just not have done any of the conversations that make sense to do, because death is real. Like, what are people's end of life care wishes? Do they want to be hooked up to a breathing machine or not? At what point do they not want, life-saving treatments if they have, degenerative Alzheimer's or dementia, and you're keeping alive someone who isn't really totally there anymore? All these sorts of questions, and families can really agonize wondering what that person would have wanted because they never had the conversation when that person was able to. Or the simple questions of like, who gets the money? Where does the stuff go? All of those odds and ends. Like there's just people leave it to the very last second, and then the person who could have told them is incapacitated, cannot have that conversation with them. And that can really get in the way of having a peaceful, a death with equanimity, a passing with just presence and love and care. Instead, it's stress and wondering, agonizing over whether you made the right decision, or who gets what and things like that. And like, these writers remind people again and again, like, have the conversation early, do it before you need it. And the majority of people still don't. That's what they say. They leave it to the last second because they're afraid to talk about it. And if you think about it at all rationally, everyone goes through this. If you care about anyone, either you or they will end up, in a hospital ward somewhere, or in a hospice, and one of you will be dying. So it makes sense to have these conversations, but we don't.
Yeah.
And so that is another kind of very concrete outcome from this death phobia. And then there's that sort of clinical sort of like that people want to whisk it away so quickly. And in the death positive community that are trying to bring back some of the older rituals, they'll do things like hold on to a body for a day or two and wash it. Try to create some really meaningful rituals and sort of funeral practices around death that, put some of that hand touch back on. What you have to remember is kind of like weddings and births, deaths are one of those great moments that families come together and create meaning and tell each other who they are. And because of that phobia around death, a lot of families really do less and less and less of that. And that kind of can increase the alienation and loneliness people feel from the people they care about. So people are trying to bring that back in. But over the last, 100 years or so, a lot of those rituals have gotten smaller and smaller until they're just like, small funeral, urn on the mantelpiece, and that's it. So there's lots of different ways that this comes into play. Finally, I think when you're looking at the great sort of news events of the day, people don't tend to take the risks of what's happening to heart. They think it can't happen to them. I remember one guy who wrote me to say he was using the app to help him process the death of 5 friends in the opiate epidemic, which was a big thing that is still, especially after the pandemic, raging through parts of America. And, one, I was shocked, like, holy shit, like this is, of course, it's running through communities. So, that makes sense. But can you even imagine being a young man and losing your entire social group to an addiction, a plague like that that's happening? It's hard to imagine what he might be going through. And I think when you're really phobic of death, you always imagine that can't happen to your kids or someone in your community or your friends. And you don't tend to take threats to life as seriously. You think you're going to be lucky. You think, it can't happen to you. But it does. And it makes sense to, be careful and take these threats seriously, and take precautions and do the right thing, and like show up for your community, because you're going to want people showing up for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I got, I got chills as you talked about the funeral being a time for families to come together, because that was a shift for me, really, because I'd always thought about the funeral as not necessarily a completely morbid event, but I never thought about it in those positive terms, being this is actually a ritual that brings people together, gives them a sense of deeper meaning and connection with each other. And it's certainly interesting to think about how we need to revivify, you might say, those traditions, those rituals that allow us to reconnect with family members and build a support around us, right, as people are dying, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I actually think rituals around death are so important, and people really minimize them today, which drives me a little bit
Yeah.
nuts. Like they're just saying, "Oh, like I hope everyone dances and have a good time because that's what I want
Mm.
them to do." Like, and sure, like you can have whatever's meaningful to you. You can make that part of your funeral, and I love that. But if you're having a funeral for family and for friends who really care about you, or you're having one for someone you care about, there's some things you want to keep in mind. One is grief. Grief is a doozy. There are people know it's emotionally hard, but they forget that it's actually has a lot of physical symptoms. Um, People can actually die from them. Like you hear these stories about people where their, partner of 30, 50 years dies and then they die like a week later. Like you can throw up, your heart can slow down, your appetite can go away. You can shake, you can get the chills, you can sob uncontrollably. Life can feel kind of off as if you're kind of like stoned or things don't make sense. Like there are all these sort of symptoms, physical symptoms that come with with grief, and that can be hard to get over. But
Mm.
one thing that can really help is, feeling connected,
Yeah.
feeling like you're having a shared experience with other people who cared about this person. And so people who are going through grief together, it makes so much sense to gather and do things that are meaningful for that group, such as sharing food, sharing some music, um, having whatever religious rites or ceremonies are appropriate for that group. um, because that grieving experience is hard, and um, it can be really nice to not feel alone in that.
Yeah.
And also because it's intense, and whenever we're having an intense experience in our bodies and in our lives, like those are the things we remember, and those are the things that sort of mark our lives. And so if you're going through that, like a big funeral, you'll always remember who was there and how you felt and what people said in a way you're not going to remember a random Tuesday. And so it's a big moment for a family to come together, for friends to come together and celebrate a life and celebrate each other.
Yeah.
Because it is going to be an intense day. It's going to help everyone who's having symptoms of grief kind of manage them better. And because it's a moment to stand up and uh, say who you are, and that you care about each other, and that you'll miss this beloved someone, but you're going to carry whatever principles they cared about most forward, as your
Yeah.
community continues through life. And I think it's really important to have rituals around death for that reason. I think there's a lot of
Mm.
wisdom in these traditions we've inherited that absolutely do have very strong rituals around death and dying.
Mm. Mm. And I guess I wanted to maybe dive a little bit into our current time period as well, because when we're talking about funerals here, um, you know, to me, one of the yeah, I'm going to voice this opinion. Even I don't want to make this political at all, but one of the most insidious things that we saw happen, I believe, in Australia here was, when COVID comes along, all of a sudden, funerals are like limited to 2 or 3 or 4 family members. That happened in Australia, where we're so afraid of death that we will even deny people to go to a funeral and grieve with each other and they did the same with weddings and everything like that. But when that happened, I thought there's something so deeply wrong about that, stopping people from actually congregating to say goodbye to somebody who's just died. And it seemed to me like this was a symptom, like we talk about here, of this death phobia, that we're so afraid of death that in a time of pandemic we'll say, no, you can't even go to a funeral. And I wonder if you've noticed, well, I guess I wonder what you have noticed about our cultures at this time when we're going through this threat of death. I mean, I certainly step back, and I think this is a real moment of reckoning where we're all coming to terms with the fact that we are completely horrified of this idea of death, even to the point where it will make us we will make completely irrational, silly decisions just because of that fear. What have you noticed?
I mean, that's such a big topic.
Yeah, yeah,
The pandemic times have put thrown everything on their head. We are social mammals. Absolutely everything that's healthy for us is usually social, from eating meals to gathering for rituals, for all these things. And once in a while, throughout history, quite a bit, these pandemics rip through and turn that on its head, where social interaction can kill you. And historically, this has always been the case. There was a long time where smallpox would rip through every around 30 years and just kill, like, I think it was like 25, 30, 40% of the population of a town and disfigure the rest. And that was just life for a millennia throughout the world, is that. And it went away for a brief period in modernity, and now we're having this COVID era and it's kind of back. So how do we manage sort of that now?
I know this is a big question, so
it's a big question, and you can go too far in either direction. Clearly, people have a need for social interaction. So, I think it was clear that, at least in America, some of the early, like, you can see no one, people are going to become alcoholics, commit suicide, and all these other terrible effects. And yet, does it make sense to have an 80-person funeral in the middle of a pandemic before there are effective treatments? Probably not. That's going to endanger a lot more people for a disease that is this deadly. One funeral should not beget the next. And that was definitely happening in America, where you saw that. So, I think people kind of have to figure it out as they go along. Right now, a lot of people in America are vaccinated, so we're doing a lot more. And doing a lot more gathering, which is wonderful. But we have these sort of vaccine deniers that sort of throw a wrench in the works. Like, how much do you wear masks inside, or scale back your gatherings to accommodate people who, aren't taking a rational look at the science and believe sort of bad information about these vaccines? And there's not a lot of easy answers to this, because we have this profound need to gather and to mark important moments such as funerals, weddings, or getting together. And we also want to protect each other. These threats are real. COVID killed a lot of people on this side of the world. I think at least I think now that Australia might be having some more issues, but the first wave, you guys did remarkably well. Not so over here. A lot of people died.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And it has just been interesting to me, I guess, especially, with my perspective in Australia, just seeing how far people will go in order to see. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I guess I completely understand how dangerous this disease is, how transmittable it is. Nonetheless, I feel as though the world is almost, it's being pulled apart by this kind of, you see so many people who are so afraid of death that they are willing to do almost anything and shift their lives in almost any way to avoid that possibility that they will get this thing and die. But then you've also got the people who are kind of pulling back on the other side, and saying, well, no, we need to get on with our lives, and death is always going to be here, and we need to be able to, move through this. And so to me, it's just interesting watching this play out, and it's, I don't know, to me, I see as much as there is unreasonable, there are unreasonable opinions on one side saying, well, don't take the vaccine, or don't do this, or don't do that. I see a lot of death phobia manifesting itself as extremely harsh reactions, where a more moderate reaction would do, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Get people reminded of death, and the emotional torque of whatever they say will go through the roof. That's been proven in terror management theory over and over again, and by half the tweets over the last year, I'd say, as well.
Yeah, man.
And, you know, at least over here, it feels like we're taking it week by week, day by day. It's a lot different than April of last year. We didn't really even know how it spread. Today, if you want to have a funeral, you ask guests to be vaccinated. Maybe you do it outside. You ask people to wear masks. You do it with a little bit of separation, and you can absolutely have a very meaningful ceremony that protects, the elderly people who might be attending and things like that, which is also important. And you can balance needs. And I think that's what people should do, actually, is they should try to have the meaningful experiences of life that they need to have and protect each other. The schools are reopening, or we're talking about schools reopening right now in the United States for the fall. And, it was really clear that Zoom education did not work for the vast majority of school children. They didn't progress and, reach the levels they were supposed to reach because it was too distracting, too difficult, just not how kids learn. It's hard enough for adults to sort of conduct business over screens all the time. And kids have less capacity for it than we do. So, the conversation we're having here is about mask mandates in schools and can that protect children who are too young to get vaccinated. And the right answer is going to come down in that middle ground of, yes, kids need to be in school. That's really important for their development. And with the right precautions, we can mitigate that risk of disease transmission so that both of these needs are met. And I think it comes down to this idea of practical wisdom. It's one of the Stoic virtues of you have to get really good at weighing the different needs in a situation, calming down, and then finding the wisest course of action, considering the facts on the ground. Because it does not make sense to stop school for several years, God forbid, and have it over Zoom because there's a pandemic. It does not make sense to not gather with your family 4 years for weddings, even when there's weddings and funerals and things going on. Did it make sense to delay some of those gatherings a few months, in April of last year when we knew nothing about this disease? Yeah, it did. And I think, this isn't the kind of question where you can just come up with a rule that's always going to be the case. It's about developing your practical wisdom over time so that you can make smart, judicious decisions that take care of all the needs on the table. And I think all throughout this pandemic, that's been a struggle for people because their anger and their temperatures get raised to such a hysteric degree that there's not a lot of practical wisdom in the room a lot of the time.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, practical wisdom. It's not easy to come by. I think, especially as we are, we really do. We face so many challenges today. Even just in terms of the technological revolution, there's so much more that we need to take into account. And it's funny how we're learning that you can't just live your life over a screen. It just doesn't work like that. We need the closeness, we need the attention, we need the community around us. So it's definitely going to be interesting watching us all continue towards an even more technologized, if that's the right word, society, and seeing what we do to bridge those gaps. But Hansa, this has been a beautiful conversation. I think leaving it in the hands of practical wisdom is a good idea. And so I want to throw it over to you. How can people, find the app, and what, I guess they'll go to the App Store, but tell people more about where they can find out what you're doing. And I want to thank you for being on the show.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. So first of all, if you want to download the WeCroak app, you can always get rid of it later if it's not for you. Just type WeCroak, one word, WeCroak, into your app store, whether you have iOS or Android. And if you have iOS, you can also sign up for the Leap membership. There'll be a little button on the bottom right that you can click. And there'll be a Stoic style daily review that kind of automates a lot of that, self-reflection at the end of the day, see your values, and a bunch more death meditations in there if that appeals to you. We also do more long form conversations about issues related to death or other things we don't talk about enough on the WeCroak Podcast that you can tune into. If you go to our website, www.wecroak.com, you can also sign up for our advice column newsletter, which is called Ask Death. And it's kind of fun. It just basically, you ask a question and death answers you. It's a practical philosophy idea I actually pulled from Stoicism as well. And it's just about, if we look at this through the eyes of death, what is the answer to this question? And it's kind of fun. So there's lots of little things that we're doing kind of on this theme that we really love that you can plug into, choose your own adventure. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Hansa, thank you so much. And yeah, I love the focus on death. I think it's important. I think it's necessary. And I actually think that it's picking up a lot of speed in our culture as well. I think a lot of people are really starting to realize that they're leaving something important behind by not taking their mind into these dark caves, thinking about death. So, Hansa, thank you for what you're doing. And I'd love to talk to you again sometime.
All right. Thank you. Till then.
Hey there, YouTubers. I just wanted to let you know that if you love this episode and you'd like many more just like it, then you can head to patreon.com/Simon J.E. Drew. There you'll get access to exclusive episodes that haven't been released yet, as well as many other benefits. Also, if you'd like to work one-on-one with me in my coaching practice, then you can head to simonjedrew.com/coaching. Talk to you soon.